So, thank you everybody for coming along today. Always exciting to get the talk started and to have more than 2 people in a room. So, you're all pretty lucky to have me here today because I've had to come a really long way. This is about as far out as Google Maps would zoom so that I could see how far I've come all the way from Western Australia in Perth. Okay, technically, I did take a detour in Canada last week, which was a little bit further than this, but I still think it counts. I'm a freelance front-end developer, which means that I spend most of my time either at the beach or at home coding in my pajamas. I'm also heavily involved in the Perth tech community, spend a lot of time at all of our meetup events, whether it's for the user group that I help run for front-end developers. I also accidentally joined the committee for DDD Perth, which is our community conference we run there, and also work as an evangelist for YOW conferences, which is a tech conference in Australia, Singapore, and Hong Kong. I also have a gorgeous grey and white border collie who is sadly in a kennel, all neglected and by himself so that you could have me here today. So he loves working next to me, next to my desk every day, loves having me work from home, but he does, however, has learnt the suitcase. So every time the suitcase comes out, he gets sad because that means I'm leaving again. But today I'm here to talk about CSS Grid. Anybody here heard of CSS Grid or just my talk title? Pretty good. For those of you who haven't heard of it, CSS Grid is a spec that came out to browsers a couple of years ago and has helped to revolutionize layouts on the web. But before I start off today, I want to tell you a bit of a story. In the beginning, there was darkness and emptiness. And then Tim Berners-Lee said, "Let there be internet." The internet was much simpler in those times. It was just HTML content on a page, similar to a Word document. But pretty soon, everybody got sick of looking at Times New Roman. And so Tim said, let the fonts and colours and sizes and positions be changeable. And then there was CSS. But before too long, it wasn't good enough either. We wanted to do more with our websites. So we discovered that you could use tables for layouts. This is really great because you could break the page up into a grid, you could merge different cells together, you could put tables inside tables. We finally had better control over how content was being laid out on our web page. However, although tables inside tables is fine, this led to tables, inside tables, inside tables, inside tables, inside tables, which is not so fun if anybody's had to deal with these before. This also made it more difficult because we started trying to make our websites work on different device sizes, and tables was really restrictive when it came to this. So we started using float. If anybody got to see Lemon's talk yesterday, you heard his little rant about float. This meant that we were back to following the separation of concerns principle, which said that HTML is for our content and CSS is how the content looks and is laid out on a page. But before too long, we found that floats also weren't working. You had to clear fix everything. There was a bunch more container divs having to be used for floating or hacks, like in Lemon's talk yesterday. And when you use media queries, you often had to do complex calculations to change or reset your previous code. Oh, and there was also a lot of using important. So by the time we'd memorized how many % wide each element needed to be in a 6-column grid with a 1% margin, we were really excited to have Flexbox arrive. We didn't have to do the percentage math anymore. I mean, who actually likes doing math? Reduce the number of media queries we needed to use, and we were finally able to center content vertically, something we hadn't been able to do since tables. We were finally starting to get the functionality that we needed out of our CSS. We no longer needed to write complicated code or to work with percentages, and our code was now more responsive than ever. But although Flexbox was really good for flowing content, there was limited control in the cross-axis. And having gaps between items tended to get complicated. You often needed to use negative margins. But things were looking up. We finally had a CSS technology that was actually built for layout. And in the distance, we could see the cavalry was on its way. In 2017, CSS Grid launched in all new major browsers. This finally gave us everything we'd been asking for CSS layouts. Like Flexbox, we were able to define a set of constraints and have the browser make the layout responsive. But we were now able to control our layout in both directions. With Grid, we're able to define areas of our layout. We're able to define whether specific elements should span multiple grid sections. We could dictate how the elements inside a grid behaved. We could reduce the code we were writing. And even better, we could reduce the thinking needed to make the layout responsive. But the question everyone keeps asking is, didn't we already have this with tables? Isn't Grid just a newer, fancier version of the table layout we've been scoffing at for years? No. CSS Grid is specifically designed for creating layouts. It's designed for this use rather than tables which we just used as a hack. Again, this is back to following the separation of concerns principles, where CSS is where we're defining how the page lays out. In saying that, tables do still have a place, but that's for tabular data or anything you would expect to see in a table. CSS Grid also helps us get back to writing logical and semantic HTML. We're no longer required to write our HTML based on how the page design looks. We can now write our HTML based on the logical flow of the document and let the CSS arrange it visually where we need to. When this is done right, this means that our content can now be more accessible for anybody using a reader mode, saving an article for later, or using a screen reader or assistive technology. Thanks to CSS Grid, mocking up the layout of an app not only takes less time, it takes less code. And to prove it, today we're going to build a note-taking app using CSS Grid. This is the wireframe of what our app is going to look like. We've got a basic HTML structure to work with, and we know what we want the layout to look like. We all know what happens next, right? This is the bit where you spend hours fighting with the layout and you got to restructure your HTML because it doesn't work properly. We're going to start off with something nice and easy. And for our app, we're going to set the new property, the new value for display, which is display grid. Hasn't really done anything. That's how you'd expect the content to look on the page. Then we're going to define what size our grid is. And first of all, we're going to use a new property called grid template columns. We've also got a new value here, which is the repeat function. Repeat allows us to take less time defining a layout. So instead of having to define how many columns when you've got 10 columns wide, you can say, I want to repeat the number of times and then the size of each column. So for example, I want to repeat 3 times a 200 pixel wide column. Gives you 3 200 pixel wide columns. But say you're having a pattern, so you could say I want to repeat twice a 10 pixel column and then a 20 viewport width column. You're not restricted by the different units you're using here as well. You don't have to use, you can use pixels, you can use percentage, viewport units, ems, rems, whatever you like. So if we look back at the code we wrote before, we have repeat 5 columns, 1 FR. Another new one. The FR unit, or fraction unit, allows us to create columns of similar or the same width without having to do all of that math about how wide. So similar to how we define a 3-column grid as being 33.333, depending on how fastidious you are, you don't have to do all of that math. You can use this when defining columns. So say for example here, I've said I have a 100 pixel wide column, a 1 FR column, a 50 pixel column, and then a 2 FR column. I also say that I want to have a gap, which I'll get back to later, of 20 pixels between each item. So we can see here I want 4 columns. The first thing as I do is I take the full element width, which is 510 pixels wide. I then take any existing content. So this is any values that I've predefined, which today we have 150 pixels, which is the 100 pixel wide and the 50 pixel wide. I then take into account the gap. So this is the gap between each of those columns, which I said that's 20 pixels wide. There'll be 3 gaps, 60 pixels. Anyone able to do the math right now? I then divide that by the number of FR units that I've defined. So I've said I want 1 FR and 2 FR. So I divide it by 3. Anyone know what the number is? This tells me that I have a 100 pixel wide column. The 1 FR becomes a 100 pixel wide column. Then I've got the 50 pixel column, and then the 2 FR becomes a 200 pixel wide column. All of that math that we used to have to do, don't have to do anymore. So the FR unit is really useful for doing grid layouts. So we go back to our code from before, repeat 5 times, 1 FR. So we're going to have 5 columns. All of them should be equal width. Next, we're going to define our rows. So this is how many, we've already defined how many columns wide it's going to be. This is how many rows high it's going to be. Similar to the template columns property, we're going to define 100 pixels, so a fixed row height, 1 FR. So this should take up any leftover room in the element, and then a 20 pixel high at the bottom. So this is what it looks like when we define our columns. Remember we had 5 columns the same width, and we can see the content's not really fitting in there properly. And then, so that was our columns. Oh, I think I've missed a screenshot there. We're then going to start to place our elements in the grid. And to do this, we can use the grid column start property. This tells it where we want a particular element to start in the grid. We want the header to start right at the beginning. So grid column start 1. We then want it to go all the way to the end of our grid. And to do this, we're going to use grid column end -1. What this does is it says I want to go right to the end no matter how wide the grid is. This means if we change how many columns wide it is, we don't have to go through and change this value. There's also a shorthand for this one, which is grid column 1/-1, start at 1, end at -1, which is the very end. Or you can simply say grid column span 5, which means you work out where it sits, but I want it to span 5 columns, which is how wide our grid is. But today we're going to, I think this is a little bit messed up in the order. Today we're going to define grid column 1 to -1 because we always want the header to go all the way across our grid. Next, we're going to define the section, which is our sidebar on the left-hand side. And to do that, it's only taking up 1 column, but we want to use grid row span 2. So similar to the columns, we want it to span 2 rows. So you can see here, our sidebar has now gone down all the way to the bottom, spanning the 2 rows, but still only sticking in the first column. Next, we want to get our main section, which is where our main note is being written, and we want that to span the rest of the way along the grid. So we want to do grid column span 4. So you can see there the main section, which is the blue and orange, has gone all the way along the grid, and it's pushed the footer down to the bottom there as well. Then we want to get the footer to go all the way to the end of the app, so we're going to use grid column span 4. And there we go, our grid is now full up. Now you can also define this using the grid template areas property. What this does is it allows you to name specific areas of your grid. You can see here in the grid template areas, we've got a different word matching up to each of the columns we've got. So each line has 5 words, and then we've also got 3 lines. So that's 1 for each of the rows. This is really useful because it's an easy way of defining when different sections are spanning multiple grid areas, different areas are spanning multiple grid sections. And it's then also really easy to assign those to the elements. This means that those elements will take up as much room as you've defined in your grid areas. Now, when you're using grid, one of the really useful tools we have available is Firefox DevTools Grid Inspector. They've built this specifically for using CSS Grid, and it's fantastic. This Grid Inspector is one of the reasons why I moved to using Firefox as my main browser. It's just fantastic. You can use it, if you can see on the screen there, it will create an overlay of where all the grid lines are. So you can see where elements are spanning multiple sections. And if you've used name areas, as we've used now, you can see it's then overlaid those names over each of the areas that we've defined before. You can find a lot of information about the Grid Inspector on the Mozilla website, and if you're using Grid, I highly recommend you have a look at it, particularly when you're first starting out. It's really easy. It's a really great tool to help you learn your way around the different properties and why things are going a particular way. So, we've done the basic layout of our website. Done. And we only used 7 lines of CSS. Anybody think that was possible before today? Also much faster. But this isn't actually how we wanted our main section to look. We wanted that orange section to actually be a sidebar there. So there's a couple of ways we could do that. We could technically apply, so the orange element, if you remembered the HTML before, the orange element is actually inside the blue element. We could apply display grid to our main blue element and then do it that way. but one of the other things that Grid has given us access to is display contents. So this is what our HTML for the main blue section looks like. We've got a main, and inside it is an article and an aside element. So there's two elements inside of that. What display contents, so you apply display contents to the main element, and what that does is it basically makes it disappear, and it means the article and the aside element become their own elements inside of our grid layout. So if we define display contents to our main, you can see there the main and the aside element are now taking up their own separate columns inside of our main grid layout. We can then change our named areas from before. So instead of note taking up the full rest of the middle row, we can leave the last column for the sidebar. Then define the article as fitting in grid area note and the aside as grid area sidebar. And they will then place themselves in our main grid. Make sense so far? So one of the big questions that's being asked now that we have CSS Grid is, does Grid replace Flexbox? If we can do all of this with Grid, do we really need to use Flexbox anymore? Can't you just use Grid all the time? So let me ask you a question. Batgirl's pretty kick-ass, right? Everyone here thinks she's pretty kick-ass? If anyone doesn't, they can leave. Black Canary, also kick-ass. But do we question whether we only need Batgirl or we also need Black Canary? No. Together, they work together and they form one kick-ass crime-fighting team. Way better than Batman, despite what my types say. I actually did not plan that. I've just realized how well that worked. Grid is really awesome for creating full page layouts and when you're needing to work in two directions. And Flexbox is still really awesome for flowing content. So Grid and Flexbox is really a super CSS layout duo. We can still use both, and you should still use both. So if we have a look at our note-taking app from before, I hope you're all appreciating my colors and my little gradients and backgrounds. The footer, it's a little bit squished up, the menu at the bottom there. We kind of want to add a bit of space. Menus and nav bars are where Flexbox is still really great to use, and I still always go to use Flexbox when I'm doing this, and vertically centering content. It's still fantastic at that. So if we apply display flex to our footer nav, we're also going to use the justify content property, which defines how the content works in the main flex axis. We're going to define space between, which basically says, look, I want to take up all of the room you've got and put equal space between each of the elements in your flex. So now we've got a nice big gap between all of our menu items. So one of the other properties we have with Grid is the justify items and align items property. So similar to Flexbox, justify content and align content properties if anyone has used them before. By default, they're set to stretch, which means they want to take up the whole of the grid space that they're in, which you've seen everything meets up really nice and neatly, even though we haven't set any width and height. And so you can see there where the footer takes up the full width of that section. But we don't really want, you can also then use justify self and align self to individually define on each grid child how we want that to work if you want it to be different. For example, we don't really want the footer to take up the full width of its space. We just want it to sit at the start and take up as much room as it needs. So we're going to set justify self, so that's just the footer element. Justify means we're working in the horizontal axis, and justify self start, we're going to get the footer to just take up as much room as it needs. You can see vertically it's still taking up the full height because we've only changed the justify property. But it is pretty squished up there now, and we don't have a gap between everything anymore. So we want to set a fixed width. So it does take up a little bit of space, just not the whole space. So we're going to set width 300 pixels, and that will then stretch that footer nav element out a little bit. So we've got a bit more of a gap between each of the items there. So if we take away my beautiful backgrounds and nice, thick, easy to see borders, fairly plain, definitely need to speak to a designer before going to production, but that's not bad. We've done like 20 minutes work. Time for beer now, right? Ignoring the fact that clearly I have added CSS beforehand because it's not in Times New Roman and it's all nice and coloured and have padding and stuff like that. We've got the full layout of an app fairly quickly, minimal effort. But this is okay while I'm wanting to edit my notes, and if I've only got a couple in the sidebar, but what if I want to have a look at all of the notes that I've got written? So we're going to create a beautiful card layout to show all of the different notes that I've got. So again, we're going to define our grid template columns. Now for this, we're using the repeat function again. I don't want to sit there and write out how many columns that I'm doing. That's too hard. And again, we've got a new property, autofill. Now, autofill says I want, so again, we know repeat is how many times what size. We can see that I want them to be 100 pixels wide. Autofill says I want you to fit in as many as you can fit. Work out how wide my element is, make each of the child elements 100 pixels wide, and just put in as many as you can. We also have access, so not only do we have autofill, but we also have autofit. Now these work slightly differently, and the way to tell the difference is to switch between the two of them until you find which one looks like you wanted it to look. But there is also a really great diagram for if neither of them seem to be working right. So the first one is our autofill property. So we've got our elements, and you can see even though we've got lots of room at the end, it's still got room to put extra elements in. So I've overlaid where the grid layer is. You can see there's a lot of empty spaces in case we added more. Autofit will work out how many it can fit in, but it will never add empty spaces if there's no room. Instead, it'll get elements to just take up all of the space available. So they will grow and stretch. So if we go back to our autofill, we want to have room for as many elements as we can fit, and they should be 100 pixels wide. But that's not what we wrote. We didn't set a fixed width. We said min-max. Min-max, as it sounds, allows you to set the minimum size you want an element to be and the maximum size an element should ever be, and it lets the computer do the math for you. So here we want an element to be at least 100 pixels wide, but we don't ever want it to be bigger than 20 viewports wide. You can also use your FR units, so you can say I want it to be at least 100 pixels wide and no more than 1 FR wide. What this does is this will say, look, it has to be at least 100 pixels wide, but then just take up all the extra space available, but they should all be the same width. You can also use 1FR, so they should all be the same width, but nothing should be wider than 300 pixels wide. So there's a lot of different things you can use min-max for. Here, we've said 300 pixels wide, so they should be at least 300 pixels wide, but they can grow and they should take up all leftover space and they should make sure they stay the same size. We've got the 1FR there. So repeat as many as we can fit in, autofill, at least 300 pixels wide, and they should all grow the same size. So like that. But we also want there to be multiple rows of things. So we use grid template rows. Again, we've got repeat. We want it to just keep repeating so that we don't have to add extra rows as we add more notes, because you know we're clearly going to be doing a lot of important stuff and taking a lot of important notes here. Autofill, as many as you can fit in, and we only want them to be 150 pixels high. Now they're nice little blocks, but we don't want them really squished up together. We want to have a gap between each of the items. And so this is where we get to use the grid gap property. Here we're defining that we want the grid, so grid gap is actually shorthand for grid column gap and grid row gap, because we want the gap to be the same both vertically and horizontally, and we want to have a gap of 20 pixels between each of the elements. Yeah, it's a nice little gap between it. So if we have a look at our grid inspector as well, we can see there where the rest of the grid is. So this gives us room to grow. You can see where there's room for extra elements to fit in, rather than it just taking up a heap of room because we've only got a couple of things there. We take away the pretty colors again. Again, pretty plain, but not bad. So all of this probably sounds a bit too good to be true, right? This sounds awesome. Why aren't we doing this everywhere? Something I haven't mentioned yet. So because of how Grid was developed, browser support actually started out pretty well. We didn't have any browser prefixes. CSS Grid was actually developed behind a feature flag. So when it actually released in main browsers, it had already undergone all of the extra testing, and we didn't have to deal with browser-specific prefixes. So what are we looking at? We've got Chrome. It's been supported since version 57. That's pretty good. Firefox, 52, so pretty good. Safari, version 10.1, it's not bad. Edge, version 16. Edge can do it, that's pretty good. Kind of. So, Internet Explorer was officially the first browser to come out with the CSS Grid spec about 5 or 6 years ago. It is actually version 1 of the spec, and it is completely different now. So technically, Internet Explorer says, yeah, display grid, I know how to do that, that's fine. But a lot of the properties associated with it are really different. If you need to support Internet Explorer, or you are really, really bored, or you're having trouble sleeping, or you're on a 15-hour flight to Australia, you can still find the version 1 spec and read it. I have not. I have no desire to do that, but some people have. I'm not going to judge. So, what do these numbers actually mean for you? I had to go and get some American stats for this one. 90.98% of browser usage in the US fully supports CSS Grid at its most recent version. That's not bad. We also have Flexbox, which, if anyone's used it before, has been around for quite a while. And unless you're doing anything funky or using some of the more complex properties of Flexbox, it's actually supported back to IE 10. If you're having to support beyond IE 10, I'm really, really sorry. Microsoft won't even support IE 10, so if you're having to support anything older than that, we feel for you. Flexbox support is looking at about 97.4% for US users. So that's pretty good. Look, honestly, I just use Flexbox if I need something that needs to support IE. If anybody's using anything older, someone said to me the other day, look, if anybody's using a browser older than IE 10, they're used to the websites looking shit. We don't need to make them look fancy. They just expect it to look like that. One of the great things about using Grid, though, is it's actually really easy to only give our Grid code to browsers that know what to do with it, because we have the supports query. So similar to the media query, the supports query allows us to define a CSS property and a value of it, and it will only do the code inside the brackets if it knows what to do with that CSS property and value. Yes, supports isn't supported in all internet browsers, but if your browser doesn't know what to do with supports, it's not going to know how to do Grid anyway, so it doesn't matter. It will just ignore the whole lot anyway. So, for example, you can say supports display grid, and it will only do the code inside, which is where you're going to put your CSS Grid code, if it knows what to do with display grid. Unfortunately, this is where you come into issues, because Internet Explorer looks at this and goes, display grid, I can do that. I know what to do with this. Hold my beer, I'll sort it out. But it's actually got no idea what the code that you've written inside is doing. So what you can actually do is, instead of using display grid, you can test for a different grid property that IE definitely doesn't know what to do with. For example, I use grid template areas, because that's not something that's supported in IE. You don't actually have to define areas there, so just putting a dot means I just want to have one area. And so that will only, the code inside the supports query will only be done by browsers that know how to use grid template areas. This is really great for creating fallback layouts, because we just say grid template areas, you put all of your grid code inside there, and you don't have to worry about unsupported code being used by your users' browsers. Wow, this is really awesome, this is really cool, and there's a workaround with supports. Can't possibly get any better than this, right? I'm currently not so patiently waiting, because CSS Grid version 2.0 is coming out. No one will tell me when. I've been tweeting at Firefox, trying to find out, going, I'm doing a talk on CSS Grid. I want to use the new version of the spec. I want to have live code demos and examples, and yet they won't respond to me. One of the really exciting things, it's got a few different updated versions. They're kind of changing some of the names of the properties and kind of making it so Flexbox and Grid use similar properties to make it easier for us so we don't have to remember which one's which. But one of the really great things about CSS Grid 2.0 is gives us access to subgrids. This means that we're then able to control elements inside of a child element to make them still lay out in relation to our grid. So for example, you can see here the beige elements on the inside of the black elements, they're still laying out in relation to where all of our grid columns and rows are. They're still deciding how exactly this is going to work. I've actually taken these screenshots from an article by Rachel Andrew, who was given access to the really test version of Grid 2.0. I replied to her to ask if I could have it, and still no response. So you can control it in both directions, or you may only want things to align in the column direction or in the row direction. That's currently what's being talked about now. As I said, these images, these screenshots have been taken from the article by Rachel Andrew, so you can find out more information about what is happening with CSS Grid there. CSS subgrid there. So, summing up. That was really it, right? Didn't cover anything else? CSS Grid is amazing. I still have moments where I'm working on something and I realize I can use Grid for a particular thing. It's like, yes, this is awesome. Can do this thing. It's amazing. It's made my job so much easier. When I first refactored my website to use Grid, I didn't use fallbacks on my website. If their browser doesn't support Grid, I don't really care. It's my website. But I changed it over to use Grid instead of Flexbox and other stuff and got to delete so much code. It is an amazing feeling. There are a lot of things we're still working out. If you've got to support the older versions of the browsers, it makes it a little bit difficult. But the thing with the supports query is you can just sort of start using it in little places along the way, little sections of your code base, and get at it easily. Also, there's a lot often being asked, well then do we need to write two layouts? Guess what? You've already written your fallback. Just add the grid code, and then browsers that support it can get the new grid layout. It's actually really easy to do, and I think everybody should start playing around with it. But I'm pretty sure I haven't taught you everything about Grid today. I mean, I only had an hour. So there's a bunch of other places you can go for more information. CSS Tricks has an amazing grid guide. I use this multiple times every day. I'm pretty sure I really skewed their stats when I was writing this talk because I was constantly having to reopen the page to look at something. It's really good, and it's got really great illustrations as well, which is useful when trying to visualize things. Wes Boss, if anybody knows him, Canadian, does really cool JavaScript courses. He also did a free course on CSS Grid. Even if you don't I don't like watching video courses, they bother me, but his courses are actually really good. So I recommend having a look and giving it a go. It's free, you've really got nothing to lose. There is also a really great book if you like to be old school. It's an actual physical book that will be mailed out to you. It's the new CSS layout, which is by Rachel Andrew, who does amazing stuff with CSS Grid. That's a really good one to get if you're wanting to have a look. Rachel Andrew and Jen Simmons, I would like to credit them with CSS Grid, but I'm pretty sure that's wrong. They both do amazing things with Grid and CSS layout, so have a look at pretty much anything by them. There's also 2 online games, which Lemon mentioned in his talk yesterday. I'm giving another shout out to CSS Grid Garden, where you can water plants and learn CSS Grid at the same time, and Flexbox Froggy, where you get to get a frog to jump around while learning Flexbox. They're 2 great, really fun ones to have a look at. I will also share out these links at the end of my talk. I was too focused on all of the other amazing talks to remember to schedule my tweets before this time. I will also be sharing my slides as well. Thank you very much for having me here in Minnesota. It has been lovely, even though the weather is miserable. I actually was like half expecting the whole place to be covered in snow, so this is like gorgeous for me. It's like, yeah, it's only 3 degrees and raining. It's fine. Sorry. I don't know what 3 degrees means to you. It's only like mostly really cold, not like don't go outside really, really cold. Thank you very much for having me along again. If anybody has any questions and they are feeling confident and would like to ask the question where everybody else can hear, I have Australian chocolates for anybody who's brave enough to do that. However, because I know most people, I'm actually seeing hands being raised, that totally worked. If anybody still doesn't want to have a chocolate and wants to quietly ask me a question later, you are welcome to come and find me. I will be around the rest of the conference. I will probably be right out at the food table as soon as we leave because I haven't been able to eat all day. So come and find me if you have any questions or tweet at me. Thank you. Okay, saw a hand. Yes.
Yeah, so the support, is it possible to have, if you had to go really every browser, it's possibly like support CSS Grid and then have like a dozen support you're like, I want CSS Grid, but if they don't do that, I want Flexbox. They only want Flexbox if they can't do CSS Grid. You mean like an else?
Not really, but you could do, so you only want Flexbox if it doesn't support CSS Grid? Or, yeah, so that's, yeah, so you write your Flexbox code and then you write your grid code inside of the supports query, and if there's any Flexbox properties you've written that you need to overwrite, you overwrite them in there, and that'll kind of, that make sense? Yeah. Otherwise, I'm not sure. You may be able to use, do you know the not CSS selector? You may be able to use the not. I know I've heard people asking, I can't remember what the answer was. However, the problem with that is then if someone doesn't support supports, they're not getting your Flexbox fallback. So although Flexbox only works on IE 10, I'm not sure how far back supports goes. So, but yeah, the whole idea is your fallback is just in your main code and then you override anything you need to inside of the supports query. Okay, everybody watch your head because I'm a horrible throw. Yes?
What browsers have announced their support for CSS Grid 2.0 on release?
Nobody. As far as, so I've had a look, I'm like, keep checking back. I feel really nerdy, like checking to find out when the latest CSS Grid is coming to like nightly version. It will most likely come out in, I haven't heard anything from Google, it'll most likely come out in Firefox first. It'll be available in the nightly browser. It'll then come out in dev. So if you keep an eye on, that's where it'll be coming out. Who knows, maybe the new IE will have it first and just completely blow us all away. Yes? Sorry.
If you are using Bootstrap as an application, the new Bootstrap, I think the Bootstrap 2, is it using CSS Grid?
As far as I'm aware, Bootstrap is not, because the support is still a issue. Yeah, I think I checked in January, it wasn't, so unless anything's just... I don't do Bootstrap. I avoid Bootstrap like the plague, and my first thing to do if I find a site with Bootstrap would be to remove it. So I don't know too much, but I'm pretty sure I got that question in January, and I'm pretty sure I checked and the answer was no. So I'd double check. Sorry.
How does this help when designing a responsive layout where on a phone you may not want 5 columns, you may shift the layout?
So depending on how you do it, that's where the auto-fit comes in handy, because it will just fit in as many as you can. Otherwise, sometimes you'll have to redefine your template areas and your columns for different breakpoints, but it sort of depends. For the overall layout like we did today, you really got to redefine it. But if you've got a card layout, you just go repeat, auto-fit. It's fantastic. Sorry. Let's see if I can go. Anybody who knows me would be so proud of how well I'm doing right now with the chocolate throwing. Were there any more questions? Okay. Thank you very much for coming along. If you've got any more questions, come find me afterwards.